Tomoe Gozen, the impossible girl. In 12th century Japan, women were born to do three things: obey their father, serve their husband, and die in silence. Tomoe Gozen broke all these rules and nearly destroyed an empire in the process. It was the 12th year of the Hogan era, 1157 by the Western calendar, when a 5-year-old girl did something that would shock an entire nation. In an era when girls were taught to walk with their heads bowed and speak in whispers, Tomoe picked up a sword. And with that sword, she would change the fate of Japan forever. The birth of a rebel. The Nakahara clan estate stretched across the lush hills of Shinano province like a carpet of rice and tradition. It was a place where time seemed to stand still, where ancestral rituals governed every moment of life, where each person knew precisely their place in the natural order of things. Tomoe Gozen didn't fit into that order. At 5, while other girls her age were practicing miniature tea ceremonies and learning to embroider cherry blossoms on silk, Tomoe stood in the training yard watching the men practice kenjutsu with an intensity that made adults feel uncomfortable. "She shouldn't be here," Nakahara Kaneto, the family's weapons master, muttered to his lord. Girls who watch men fight develop inappropriate ideas. But Tomoe wasn't just observing. She was memorizing every move, every technique, every mistake. Her small eyes followed the swords like a hawk following prey, absorbing knowledge no child her age, let alone a girl, should possess. When they thought she wasn't looking, she would pick up twigs and imitate the movements she'd seen. Her small hands held pieces of wood like sacred blades, her feet dancing through the family gardens, silently reproducing complex kata she'd memorized. It was his nurse, a wise old woman named Masaba, who first realized what was happening. "This child is not normal," she told Tomoe's mother one autumn afternoon, watching the girl fight imaginary enemies among the maple trees. "She has the spirit of a warrior, trapped in the body of a princess." Tomoe's mother, a traditional woman who had spent her entire life following rules she never questioned, felt a chill run down her spine. "That's impossible. Women aren't born with warrior spirits." "Then," Masaba replied with an enigmatic smile, "perhaps this is no ordinary woman." And she was about to prove it in a way no one expected. The first transgression. The Midsummer Festival of 1160 should have been like all others, a peaceful celebration where the region's noble families gathered to demonstrate prosperity and maintain political alliances. It was an event where appearances mattered more than substance, where every gesture was choreographed according to traditions dating back centuries. Tomoe, now 8, should have been sitting quietly beside her mother, watching the men's martial displays with the appropriately disinterested expression expected of well-bred girls. She should have been thinking about embroidery and tea ceremonies, not sword techniques and military formations. Instead, he was plotting. "I can do better than this," she whispered to herself, watching a young samurai demonstrate a kata sequence she'd seen practiced in her courtyard. The young man was competent, but Tomoe had memorized more refined versions of the same moves. The opportunity came when the young man challenged the spectators. "If anyone can improve this technique, come and demonstrate." It was a rhetorical provocation. No man present would dare publicly challenge a samurai during a formal demonstration. It was exactly the kind of moment one expected to be followed by respectful silence and polite applause. Tomoe stood up. The murmur that ran through the crowd was like wind through a wheat field. Heads turned, conversations stopped, breaths were held. An 8-year-old girl had just stood up to challenge a grown samurai to combat. "Tomoe!" his mother hissed, horrified. "Sit down immediately!" But the girl was already walking toward the center of the demonstration area, her small but determined steps echoing like war drums in the sudden silence. Every meter she advanced broke another social barrier, violated another sacred rule. The young samurai Minamoto no Noriyori was so shocked that he was initially speechless. He was a battle-hardened man, accustomed to unexpected situations, but nothing had prepared him for being challenged by an 8-year-old in a pink silk kimono. "Little one," he said finally, his voice a mixture of amusement and discomfort, "I believe you misunderstand. This is a demonstration for samurai." I understand perfectly, Tomoe replied, his voice clear and firm despite his age, and I can show you a better way to execute the fifth movement of the kata you just demonstrated. The silence that followed was so profound that you could hear the wind rustling through the bamboo leaves in the adjacent gardens. What happened next would change not only Tomoe's life, but an entire society's perception of what a woman could become. The moment that changed everything. Noriori looked around at the elders present, seeking guidance in a situation without precedent. Some discreetly gestured for him to ignore the child and continue the demonstration. Others seemed curious to see where this unthinkable transgression would lead. It was Nakahara Kanehira, Tomoe's cousin and future brother-in-law, who broke the deadlock. By 15, he was already recognized as a sword prodigy and possessed the confidence that came from natural talent combined with intensive training. "Let her try," he said, his voice cutting through the silence like a sharp blade. "If an 8-year-old girl thinks she can teach a samurai swordsmanship, then let her show us her wisdom." There was malice in his words, the clear intention to publicly humiliate Tomoe, and through that humiliation, teach her a lesson she would never forget about her proper place in society. It was juvenile cruelty disguised as pedagogical justice. Noriori hesitated for a moment longer, then handed her training sword to Tomoe with a gesture that was both condescension and morbid curiosity. The wooden weapon was almost as tall as she was, too heavy for her small hands, unbalanced for her childish frame. Tomoe picked up the sword, and immediately everyone could see that she could barely lift the weapon properly. Her small hands struggled to find a proper grip on the hilt, her arms trembling slightly from the weight. Smiles appeared on some faces, relief on others. The natural order of things would be restored in moments when the arrogant child discovered that fantasies were different from reality. Then Tomoe started moving. The first movements were hesitant, clumsy, exactly what everyone expected from a child playing with adult weapons. But gradually, something extraordinary began to happen. His movements became more fluid, more precise, more professional. She wasn't just imitating the kata she'd seen Noriori perform, she was correcting him. The fifth move Noriori had demonstrated was a classic defensive transition, functional but predictable. Tomoe's version included a subtle feint that would turn a defense into a counterattack, an adjustment in foot position that improved balance, a change in the angle of the blade that would create an opening in the opponent's guard. These were refinements that an experienced master might take years to develop. She had deduced them by watching training sessions and practicing in secret with twigs. When the sequence ended, the silence was no longer one of shock or disapproval. It was one of recognition. Everyone present, even those without formal martial arts training, could see that they had witnessed something extraordinary. Noriori took the sword back with hands that trembled slightly. How did you learn this?" "Observing," Tomoe replied simply. "And thinking." It was then that Kanehira did something that would change the course of 2 lives. Instead of humiliating Tomoe as he had planned, he approached her with an expression that mixed respect with something that could be called reverent fear. "Do you really want to learn?" he asked. Tomoe's response was a smile that contained all the hunger, all the ambition, all the fierce determination that would define his extraordinary life. "I was born to learn." And so began the training of the woman who would become Japan's most feared warrior. The first master. Tomoe's training began the day after the festival, in the hours before dawn, when the world was still shrouded in mist, and the only sounds were those of nocturnal insects giving way to the morning chorus of birds. Kanehira had set strict rules. She would train in secret, away from the eyes of adults who might intervene. She would learn only basic techniques, nothing that could be considered true military training. And above all, she would maintain absolute silence about her lessons. "If anyone finds out," he had warned, "the training stops, forever. Understand?" Tomoe had only nodded, but his eyes shone with the promise of well-kept secrets. The first few months were brutal. Kanehira, despite his youth, was a relentless instructor who had inherited both the natural talent of his bloodline and the iron discipline of the Minamoto military tradition. He forced Tomoe through basic exercises, repeated thousands of times until they became instinctive. "Strength isn't enough," he explained, watching her fight with a sword still disproportionate to her size. "Women will never have the brute strength of men. But speed, technique, intelligence, these are weapons anyone can develop." Tomoe absorbed every word like dry land absorbs rain. Every correction of posture, every adjustment of technique, every fragment of martial philosophy was memorized and incorporated into his developing style. But it was during the rest periods that the real learning took place. Kanehira, initially reluctant to train a girl, discovered that she possessed a strategic mind that rivaled that of seasoned generals. "Why attack first when you can make your opponent attack where you want?" she asked during one of her lessons on timing. It was a question that demonstrated tactical understanding far beyond her years. "Explain," Kanehira said, intrigued. "If I feign an opening here," she demonstrated with slow movements, "the opponent will attack instinctively. But if I expected him to attack there, I can be prepared to counterattack here." Her movements were precise, calculated, demonstrating an intuitive understanding of combat that impressed even her seasoned instructor. Kanehira realized at that moment that he wasn't just teaching basic techniques to a curious child. He was forging a weapon that could one day rival Japan's finest warriors, and that scared him as much as it thrilled him. But all secrets are eventually discovered, and some discoveries change destinies forever. The secret revealed. It was in the winter of their second year of training that the inevitable happened. Nakahara Kaneto, the family's weapons master, discovered the secret. He had noticed subtle changes in Tomoe, the way she walked, the way she held objects, the way her eyes automatically scanned for weaknesses in any situation. These were signs only a seasoned warrior would recognize, hallmarks of someone who had received true martial training. One freezing December morning, he followed Tomoe as she left before dawn. What he found in the secret clearing simultaneously horrified and amazed him. Tomoe was no longer the clumsy child who had fought with a sword too heavy for her hands. She was a young warrior, whose technique rivaled that of adult samurai, whose movements possessed a lethal grace that spoke of years of intensive training. "Stop!" His voice echoed through the clearing like a divine command. Kanehira froze mid-attack, immediately recognizing the authority in his voice. Tomoe turned slowly, his expression calm, but prepared for what he knew was inevitable. "Master Kaneto," she said, bowing formally, "I had hoped you would discover me sooner." The blunt honesty surprised her. He had expected denial, apologies, perhaps tears. Instead, he found a young woman who faced him with the dignity of a samurai, accepting the consequences of his actions. "You know what that means," he said, his voice a mixture of wonder and sadness. "Yes," Tomoe replied. "It means you now have a choice." Kaneto frowned. "What choice?" "You can forbid me from training and waste a talent you yourself recognize." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle in the cool morning air. "Or you can become my true sensei and help me become the warrior we both know I can be." It was a bold challenge from a 10-year-old to a seasoned weapons master. It was also a display of courage that would define all of Tomoe's future relationships with authority figures. Kaneto looked at her for a long moment, then at Kanehira, finally back at the girl who had just redefined his understanding of the possible. "Tomorrow at dawn," he said finally, "and if you can't keep up with my real training, you'll go back to embroidery and tea ceremonies forever." Tomoe's smile was like the sunrise, bright, inevitable, and promising a new world. In the next episode of Tomoe Gozen, Kaneto subjects Tomoe to the most brutal training any samurai has ever faced. But when a group of bandits attacks the family estate, she will have her first chance to prove she can fight and kill like a true warrior.